Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last class, we talked about World War I and how the Great War was ultimately fought to a stalemate. Today in episode 3, we're going to talk about how the balance was tipped. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to summarize why America entered the Great War. You should be able to describe how the United States mobilized for that war and to summarize American battlefield successes. And number 9, you should be able to summarize United States offenses and the end of the war. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 7. Here I want to talk about how the United States began to feel the effects of World War I, and begins with the British blockade. Because immediately at the outbreak of the war, the British blockaded and mined the North Sea. The North Sea would keep any German ships from getting out of kind of that area, and so basically to hold an import restriction onto Germany. That's important because Germany's fighting a two-front war. They've got one war where they're fighting with France, and then they've got another war that they're fighting with Russia. And so there's this narrow corridor where they have a chance to import things to their country that isn't going through a war front, and that then gets blockaded by the British Navy. This stopped war supplies from reaching Germany, and the blockade was unusually restrictive. Normally, a naval blockade doesn't stop non-military things like food or fertilizer from reaching Germany. But then in 1917, the famine struck Germany, and that happened when this unusually restrictive blockade was going on, and Germany felt like Great Britain was actually trying to starve the country into submission. This was seen as an unfair way of fighting the war because it dragged civilians in as potential enemy targets. Americans considered this also to be a violation of the open door policy. You'll remember the open door policy is one of those creations of John Hay after the Spanish-American War. But before the United States could really focus a protest on British shipping, Germany responded for themselves. Subpoint B, Germany set up a counter blockade of Great Britain with their brand new undersea boats, those U-boat submarines. Any British or Allied ship in the waters anywhere near Britain were sunk without warning. This was an aggressive policy, and a lot of people thought that maybe this was Germany going too far in reaction. In May 7th of 1915, a U-boat sank a British liner. So this is a passenger ship known as the Lusitania. On that ship, there was 128 Americans. Passenger ships were not considered fair targets for war. These are civilians who are not belligerents. But Germany insisted that this particular passenger ship was also hauling ammunition and using civilians as human shields for military transport. That's probably true. The Lusitania was built with a secret compartment specifically for smuggling things like ammunition. Nevertheless, American public opinion began to turn against Germany when it started costing American lives. President Wilson protested this submarine war, but despite Wilson's protests, Germany kept sinking ships anyway. Calling for peace without victory, Wilson ruled out a military response. He hoped to negotiate a way to end World War I instead. Then Germany sank another liner, this one also a passenger ship known as the Sussex. This one was flying under a French flag. And again, it killed some Americans. And again, Wilson protested this policy to the Germans. In negotiation, Germany asked the United States to get Great Britain to end the food blockade. Otherwise, they said they would continue this unrestricted submarine war. It's not like the Germans were against all blockades. A blockade is considered a fair naval tactic, but to put a restriction on things like food and fertilizer, Germany needed that thing lifted. Subpoint C. Britain refused to end the blockade. I need to get this. They refused to end the blockade. And if they didn't, then Germany was going to keep doing what they were going to do. Subpoint C. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson was up for re-election, and he ran for re-election against a Republican candidate. This one, a current Supreme Court justice, a guy named Charles Evans Hughes. Charles Evans Hughes was the Republican candidate, and Wilson ran against him on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." While Hughes pledged to defend economic interests militarily, so this is kind of like the dividing line between the two candidates. Charles Evans Hughes says that basically we know that Americans are going to go to war and that it's time for Americans to go stand up and defend their own interests. Wilson says this is not our war and we don't have a dog in this fight, so we should stay out of it. And he ran proudly on his record of not getting the United States in that World War I. It was a close election, and Charles Evans Hughes actually went to bed that night thinking that he had won the election. When a reporter tried to reach him to tell him of his loss, an aide answered the phone and said, "The president cannot be disturbed." The reporter reportedly replied, "Well, when Mr. Hughes wakes up, tell him he's no longer the president." Of course, Charles Evans Hughes was never the president, but he went to bed thinking that he was going to wake up president. It's point D. In 1917, Woodrow Wilson tried to mediate the conflict. He wanted to call for a peace between equals to bring people together. Despite calls for peace, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany announced that the U-boats would resume sinking all British ships. Or basically all ships in British waters, regardless of what flag they're flying. It almost certainly meant that American boats would be sunk and that the United States would enter the war. But Woodrow Wilson, just like he says with Mexico, he says we need to wait for actual overt acts before going into a conflict. Then Germany made actual overt acts. And here we got a couple of pieces here. January of 1917, a telegram from the German foreign minister in Mexico was intercepted by British agents. So you have a telegram from Germany to Mexico intercepted by the British in the way. The telegram becomes known as the Zimmermann Note, and it proposed that Germany and Mexico make an alliance. And in that alliance, Mexico should attack the United States. And if it's a successful attack, then Germany promised that it would help Mexico reclaim the lands of Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, which had been previous Mexican territories. This was not as far-fetched as it may sound to us moderns. Remember that the United States and Mexico had nearly gone to war over the Pancho Villa affair. About that same time, Germany sunk 4 unarmed American merchant ships, killing 36 Americans. Now, sinking those ships is important because it means that now Germany is attacking directly American property, and they're merchant ships. They're not even warships. These are just vessels for transporting goods. The final piece of resistance, though, fell when the Russian monarchy was overthrown in the Bolshevik Revolution and replaced the monarchy with what appeared to be a representative, democratic kind of government. That made the Great War into a war of democracies against monarchies. And Wilson, who's always committed to that idea of missionary diplomacy and advancing democracy above all else, well, it looks like the absolute monarchy of Russia has just fallen. And the Bolsheviks, this new communist country, appeared at least for a while to be a democratic country. And so Wilson could join in the Great War without being a hypocrite. Roman numeral number 8. Calling to make the world safe for democracy, Woodrow Wilson set out to raise an army. The Selective Service Act of 1917 required every man in America to go register for a draft. Then they would be randomly chosen for military service. By the end of 1918, so by the next year, 24 million men were registered, and 3 million of which were chosen for active service. By the end of the war, 2 million of those 3 million were actually served in active duty. Around 400,000 African Americans served in segregated units, but they were totally excluded from the Navy and from the Marines. Most black people were assigned to non-combat duties, though there were some exceptions. In general, the military thought it was unwise to give a black person a gun. This just further evidence of how Wilson's America just doesn't understand race relations. Military training was revamped. Now soldiers would train for 8 months, and training took mostly place in the United States. This was a dramatic change from our last significant military conflict, that of the Spanish-American War, where Americans were sent into combat with poor training. No, the Great War was a war of science and technology, and I think the scientific approach to warfare needed to be carried out here as well. So they would train for 17-hour days, which is a long time, on a variety of tasks, from target shooting to bayonet drills to kitchen duty to cleaning up the camp and the grounds. Weapons were scarce, particularly in the early days of the war, and so trainees drilled with fake weapons until they were proficient. They would grab a rock about the size of a grenade, because there weren't enough grenades to go around, and throw that instead. They would have poles about the length and weight of a rifle, because there weren't enough rifles to go around either. Women were not allowed to enlist in the armed forces, but they did serve in the Army and the Navy and the Marines in non-combat positions like nursing and secretary work and phone operators. The Army refused to give these women rank and benefits. In the Navy and the Marines, though, women were given full military rank and eligible for full military benefits. Though the Navy had grown during the Spanish-American War, it was decidedly outclassed by the standards of 20th century naval warfare. So the United States needed to expand its fleet to go transport men and goods and food and equipment to Europe. And so to do that, the United States took a pretty aggressive policy towards shipbuilding. The United States gave special status to shipyard workers, exempting them from the draft or deferring them from the participation in the draft. Most American men had to be eligible draftees, but if you worked in a shipyard, then that was seen as service to the country, and you didn't have to be expected to be drafted. The United States Chamber of Commerce joined a public relations campaign to convince people of the importance of shipyard work, serving their country by working to go build a Navy fleet. The Chamber of Commerce gave flags to shipyard workers, just like soldiers and their families received. They convinced car owners, and here in the 19-teens, not everybody has a car. They're still kind of a rare technology. They convinced car owners to give rides to shipyard workers when public transit became crowded. Hey, we got to get these guys to work because America needs their efforts. They used new fabrication techniques like building standardized parts of ships in other places and then trucking them in on rail cars for final construction. This was one of the most effective techniques, to be able to outsource parts of ship construction and bring it in for final assembly at the port. That cuts production time significantly. And on July 4th of 1918, the United States, in kind of a show of naval power, launched 95 ships on the same day, 4th of July in 1918. The government took over commercial and private ships as well, turning them into warships. Even American ocean liners, which were just passenger transport ships, were enlisted for military duty. The Navy also developed a plan to escort merchant ships across the Atlantic in a method known as the convoy system. Here, various armed military ships would accompany trade ships to go protect those merchant vessels, and then that would cut their losses dramatically. Remember, all vessels that entered foreign lands were subject to get sunk. So shipping ships, merchant ships, had military escorts. The Navy also laid mines across the North Sea, just like the British did. They kept U-boats out of the Atlantic. And by 1918, Germans were having difficulty replacing boats and trained submariners because the Americans' response was so significant. Subpoint C. After 2.5 years of fighting, Europe's Allied forces were exhausted and demoralized. 2.5 years of trench warfare, getting millions of people killed and not really trading any land for it, was just weighing so much heavy on Allied forces. Germany was also having problems as well. German law had required soldiers to be at least 19 years old, but in practice, they were enlisting boys to youngest fight as 14 years old. High school freshmen were sent off to go fight the Great War. American troops arrive on the side of the Entente forces, and they brought new soldiers. But more importantly, they brought freshness and enthusiasm and just weren't carrying the baggage of 2.5 years of stalemate. General John J. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Force into Europe. Nicknamed the Doughboys, and it's a little unclear why, but probably one of the reasons is that they used a cleaning agent known as a dough to keep their belts polished. We're not really sure why they're called Doughboys. That's the best example. It's the best explanation of it. But John J. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Force into Europe. These Doughboys, the American troops, they were working their way, way beyond their previous experience. Most Americans were farmers back home, and so they were impressed by the great cities of Europe. They were, though, also shocked by the battle and its modern weapons. These were kids that were on an adventure that they couldn't even imagine before they arrived in Europe. Roman numeral number 9. American troops then go on the offensive. Allies began to stop the German advance. When Russia pulled out of the war in November of 1917, the same thing that took Tsar Nicholas out, when Tsar Nicholas was removed and later killed, that new government said, this war is not our war, and they basically just gave up. They I don't want to say they surrendered, but they pulled out. That I think is the best way to say it. Russia pulled out of the war in November 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. Tired Russian and German soldiers, they were at war just a few days earlier. Now they gathered to shake hands and walk away. In response then, Germany took all of those troops that were on their eastern front and moved them to the western front to go fight in France. And then they began to see real battlefield gains. In May of 1918, Germany was in 50 miles of Paris and looked like they might take the capital. Americans helped stop the German advance, really just in time, arriving just right at the end. And there they pushed back the German offensive through the months of July and August of 1918. By September of 1918, the tide had turned against the Central Powers, and it looks like the American troops are going to go push Germany back out of France. Here I want to introduce Alvin York. Alvin York was a rare American war hero. The truth is that America doesn't fight significantly in World War I. We show up at the end and kind of take credit for the victory. Maybe rightly, I don't know, maybe a little bit more complicated, but a genuine hero of the war, Alvin York. Alvin York was originally a conscientious objector. A conscientious objector is a class of person that says they are philosophically opposed to war on moral grounds. A conscientious objector might be drafted into the Army, but if they've registered as a conscientious objector, wouldn't be sent into combat roles. They might be sent into support roles or work as medical aid or, food help or, any kind of other course, but they wouldn't be sent into combat roles. And Alvin York believed with a religious conviction that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was a universal command, and it couldn't be violated. Over time, though, Alvin York began to consider the Great War to be a just war, to be a fair war. And he was, and therefore, a just war, he believed, it would be fine for him to fight in, morally acceptable. So then, York dedicated himself to soldiering, just as much as he had previously committed himself to pacifism. On October 8th, in 1918, armed only with a rifle and a revolver, Alvin York single-handedly killed 25 Germans, and with 6 other people, he captured 132 prisoners. Generals and commanders just heaped praise on Alvin York, and he was promoted to sergeant, eventually became an American celebrity, and became one of the most decorated soldiers of World War I. Subpoint C. On November 3rd of 1918, Austria-Hungary surrendered to the Entente forces. That same day, German sailors mutinied, and it set off a chain reaction across German forces. On November 9th, socialist leaders established a brand new German republic, and they forced Kaiser Wilhelm to abdicate and flee to Holland. So now you have the head of Germany saying "I'm out, the army's quitting," he goes into exile. Exhausted Germans signed an armistice agreement on November 11th, 1918, known then as Armistice Day, but now is remembered in the United States as Veterans Day. 10 million people immediately became refugees, having been displaced from their homes or having their homes destroyed. World War I remains the single bloodiest war in American history as a matter of human warfare. Although this is a little bit hard to count, and sometimes you could make the claim that World War II is, but in terms of battlefield losses, more than half of the 22 million dead were civilians themselves, and more than 20 more were wounded. It's a bloody war, and it's one of the deadliest in human history. But we need to spend a little bit more time on it because World War I, I'm also going to argue, is the transitional moment for the 20th century. It's going to change things back in America. It's going to change things in Europe. It's going to change things in Asia and have an impact in Africa. All of these things literally change the world, and I can't wait to tell you more about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.